Karen Horney against Freud. Karen Horney stood at the podium with a steady gaze, the low hum of anticipation filling the lecture hall. It was 1941 in New York City, and she was about to address a crowd of psychoanalysts and students on why she had broken away from orthodox Freudianism. This was not just an academic lecture. It was a declaration of independence. As she surveyed the expectant faces, Karen could not help but recall the winding path that had brought her here, from a rebellious girlhood in Germany to this pivotal moment of asserting her own vision of psychology. She cleared her throat, heart pounding not with fear, but with conviction, and began to speak of ideas that Sigmund Freud himself would surely have bristled at. Decades earlier, on a gray morning in 1880s Hamburg, a young Karen Danielsen peered out the window of her family's home, wondering what future the world held for a girl like her. Born on September 16, 1885, in the Blankenese district of Hamburg, Germany, Karen had come into a household governed by contradictions. Her father, Berndt Danielsen, was a sea captain and a devout authoritarian Protestant, known in the family as the Bible thrower, for his harsh literalism. By contrast, her mother, Clotilde, Sonni, was more liberal and nurturing, yet prone to bouts of depression and irritable dominance. In this environment, the sensitive and intelligent Karen learned to navigate both cold severity and stormy emotion. She sought refuge in books and in her own diary, where she sketched out dreams far beyond the confining walls of her childhood. From the time she was a girl, Karen felt the sting of her father's preference for her older brother, also named Berndt. She adored her brother deeply and yearned for the same esteem her father reserved for him. Berndt was doted upon, the son who could do no wrong, while Karen often sensed that being born a girl was her original sin in her father's eyes. At age 9, feeling plain and unvalued for her looks, she made a quiet vow to herself. If she could not be the pretty, doted-on daughter, she would prove her worth through intellect and achievement. In her diary, young Karen imagined becoming a doctor, an outrageous ambition for a girl in 19th century Germany, when universities did not even admit women. Yet she wrote it anyway, filling pages with youthful confidence that she would one day make something of herself beyond the expectations set for her sex. Karen's hunger for affection and recognition had deep roots. In a fervent but innocent attempt to find love, the adolescent girl even developed a schoolgirl crush on her beloved older brother. When he rebuffed her, embarrassed by her girlish infatuation, Karen was mortified. The rejection plunged her into the first of several depressive spells that would recur throughout her life. The experience taught her, painfully, how fragile one's inner world could be when love was withdrawn. It was a lesson she never forgot. Later, as a theorist, she would argue that the basic anxiety of feeling unwanted and unsafe in childhood could haunt a person's psyche for years. In 1904, Karen's mother finally made a bold escape from the stifling marriage. She left Karen's domineering father and took 19-year-old Karen and her brother with her. Though they did not formally divorce, this separation was a rare act of independence for a woman of that era, and it left an impression on Karen. Perhaps watching her mother seize her freedom kindled in Karen an even stronger desire to pursue her own path. Against the odds and against her father's wishes, Karen enrolled in medical school in 1906. Germany had only just begun opening higher education to women a few years earlier, and she eagerly took her place among the first generation of female medical students. Imagine the sight: Karen Danielsen, at 20, walking into the lecture halls of the University of Freiburg with her books held tight, one of only a handful of women in a sea of young men in dark suits. Whispers followed her, some curious, others disapproving, yet she held her head high. Her determination outshone any trepidation. She was going to be a doctor. She would not be confined to the domestic sphere that society had prescribed. At medical school, Karen thrived. She proved herself an excellent student, transferring to Göttingen and then Berlin to round out her education. During these years of study, a new realm of ideas captivated her: the burgeoning field of psychoanalysis. Vienna, not far away, was abuzz with talk of Dr. Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious mind, sexuality, and dreams. Karen's own mind, ever hungry for understanding human behavior, not least her own bouts of depression and longing, was drawn to these radical ideas. Psychology offered a window into the conflicts between our secret inner desires and the strictures of society. Conflicts she herself had felt keenly as a young woman chafing under convention. Amid her studies, life brought Karen love as well. Through a fellow student, she met a young businessman named Oscar Horney. Oscar was steady, successful, and supportive of Karen's intellectual ambitions. The two married in 1909 when Karen was 24. Soon after, they moved to Berlin, where Karen continued her medical training at the renowned Charité Hospital, while Oscar pursued his career. Within a year, Karen experienced a dramatic convergence of life events. She gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Brigitte, and heartbreakingly, lost both her parents in short succession. Becoming a mother and an orphan in the same year was an emotional whiplash. Amid the joy of holding her newborn, Karen mourned the death of her own mother and the distant, unresolved relationship with her father, who passed away not long after. Overwhelmed by grief and the responsibilities of new motherhood, she sought relief in the very discipline she had been studying, psychoanalysis. In 1910, Karen entered therapy with Karl Abraham, a Freudian analyst in Berlin, commencing an inward journey to confront her depression and inner conflicts. Week after week, she unburdened her soul in the analyst's office. The wounds of her childhood, the ache for affection, the anger at her father's favoritism, and her husband's occasional high-handedness. After Abraham, she continued analysis with Hans Sachs. These experiences not only helped Karen cope during a dark time, they also provided an apprenticeship in the craft of psychoanalysis itself. She was learning from the inside out how probing the psyche could bring relief, and how it sometimes needed to evolve beyond the formulas set by Freud in faraway Vienna. By 1913, Karen Horney had completed her medical degree and qualified as a doctor. It was a triumph not just personally, but historically. Few women of her generation had done so. She and Oscar went on to have 2 more daughters, and Karen embarked on her career in psychiatry, just as World War I and its aftermath shook Europe. In the post-war years, Berlin became a vibrant center for psychoanalysis, second only to Vienna. Karen joined the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute and began teaching there in 1920, one of the first women to ascend to such a position. She was both a dutiful member of Freud's fold and already a quiet heretic, harboring ideas that would gradually diverge from the master's orthodoxy. In her lectures, she diligently taught Freudian theory, yet in her heart, she questioned parts of it. How could she not? As a woman and a keen observer of cultural pressures, Karen saw aspects of human experience that the male architects of psychoanalysis overlooked. Through the early 1920s, Horney carried on the expected roles of her era: doctor, teacher, mother, and wife, with impressive skill. But under the surface, turbulence brewed. She maintained a busy practice, seeing patients, mostly women, who poured out tales of anxiety, oppression, and longing that resonated with her own experiences. She also navigated the politics of the Berlin psychoanalytic circle, dominated by men loyal to Freud. Outwardly, she was the picture of a respectable Freudian disciple. Inwardly, she was gathering observations that would soon lead her down a different path. Then came 1923, the year that nearly broke her. That year, a cascade of misfortunes befell Karen. Her husband Oscar's business collapsed, leaving the family in a financial ruin that strained their marriage. As if echoing that collapse, Oscar himself collapsed in health, suffering a severe bout of meningitis that left him emotionally volatile and depressed. He became, in Karen's words, a morose, bitter man, almost a stranger from the cheerful partner she had once known. Around the same time, Karen's beloved older brother, the very brother whose approval she had craved since childhood, died suddenly of a lung infection. The double blow of her husband's decline and her brother's death plunged Karen into a despair deeper than any she had known before. All her old wounds of abandonment and unworthiness yawned open. One summer day, while attempting to vacation by the seaside to lift her spirits, Karen was overcome by hopelessness. In the grip of depression, she walked into the cold surf and swam out, farther and farther, as if the chill of the water might numb the pain inside. For a moment, she considered not turning back. The sea was vast and indifferent. How easy it would be, she thought, to simply keep swimming until her strength gave out, to slip under the waves and let the dark water close over her. She floated there for a long, quiet moment, contemplating oblivion. But thoughts of her daughters, 3 little girls who needed their mother, pierced the darkness. Karen turned and fought her way back to shore, gasping, trembling, but alive. Crawling onto the beach, she felt the weight of her despair, but also a faint spark of resolve. She would not surrender. Life had work left for her to do. Karen's near encounter with death became a turning point. Having confronted the abyss of her own psyche, she emerged with a renewed determination to change the very psychoanalytic practices that had thus far failed to prevent such despair. She later wrote that many neurotic symptoms were not simply the result of forbidden sexual wishes, as Freud insisted, but were desperate coping strategies, attempts to navigate a jungle of dangers in life. In her own darkest hour, she had felt utterly isolated and helpless, exactly what she would come to define as basic anxiety, the foundational fear of being alone in a hostile world, originating in childhood, when one's need for warmth and safety goes unmet. Karen began to see neurosis not as a fixed illness to be cured by uncovering a single infantile secret, but as a continuous process shaped by relationships and culture. This insight was germinating, even if she had not yet articulated it fully. In the years that followed, Karen's life underwent decisive changes. By 1926, she made the difficult choice to separate from Oscar. His authoritarian streak had grown more pronounced, eerily mirroring her own father's tyranny. She realized, with some regret, that she had acquiesced too often to his way of running the household, even when she disagreed. But now, having survived depression and reclaimed her will to live, Karen was not willing to live under any yoke of domination. Not her father's, not her husband's, and not even Sigmund Freud's. She moved out with her 3 daughters, initiating a new chapter as a single, working mother. In 1937, she would finalize her divorce from Oscar, freeing herself legally and emotionally. All the while, Karen continued her professional ascent. Throughout the late 1920s, she taught and practiced at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, earning respect for her clinical acumen. Yet, her ideas continued to drift from strict Freudian doctrine. She published papers questioning Freud's portrayal of women. One audacious paper argued that what Freud had dubbed penis envy in women was overstated and misconstrued. Women's feelings of inferiority, she suggested, did not stem from biology or some missing organ, but from being raised in a society that valued men more and restricted women's opportunities. If some women envied men, Karen argued it was largely jealousy of men's generic power in the world, the freedom and education men enjoyed that women were denied. The psychoanalytic old guard was not pleased. Here was a woman in their ranks daring to say that Freud's understanding of female psychology was incomplete, even biased. Freud himself, upon hearing of Horney's challenges, grew notably cool toward her. The once cordial collegial relations iced over. Karen, however, did not back down. She continued to refine her critique, even whimsically suggesting that if women unconsciously envied men's anatomy, men might likewise harbor womb envy, a deep-seated envy of women's ability to bear children and bring forth life. Perhaps, she mused, men's drive for achievement and status was partly a compensation for not being able to create life as women do. These ideas were incendiary, turning Freud's theories upside down, and they positioned Karen Horney as a rebel within psychoanalysis. By 1932, the atmosphere in Germany was changing in ominous ways. Adolf Hitler's rise was underway, casting a shadow over the intellectual circles of Berlin, especially for those, like many psychoanalysts, who were Jewish or associated with liberal thought. Though Karen was not Jewish, many of her colleagues and friends were. Psychoanalysis itself was branded by the Nazis as Jewish science. Sensing the danger and weary of battling Freud's followers on their home turf, Karen accepted an invitation to move to the United States. A colleague, Franz Alexander, had offered her a position at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. It was an opportunity to start fresh in a new country and perhaps to spread her own ideas more freely. That year, Karen and her daughters boarded a ship bound for America. She was 47, embarking on a second life. On the voyage across the Atlantic, she likely felt a mix of anxiety and hope. In her cabin at night, the ocean rolling beneath, she might have reflected on all she was leaving behind: a Europe descending into madness, a marriage that had long run its course, a psychoanalytic establishment that had spurned her independence. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also the promise of reinvention. She was carrying not only suitcases, but a head full of revolutionary ideas about mind and culture that had yet to find their full voice. Arriving in Chicago, Horney embraced her new role. As associate director of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, she quickly became a respected teacher and analyst in the American scene. She found American students eager to hear her perspective, especially as she emphasized the importance of social and environmental factors in personality, a refreshing counterpoint to Freud's focus on biological drives. After 2 years, Karen felt the pull of New York City, the burgeoning center of psychoanalysis in the U.S. She moved to Brooklyn in 1934, joining the faculty of the New School for Social Research and soon also teaching at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. Brooklyn in the 1930s was a fertile ground for new ideas. It was home to a vibrant community of analysts, including many European émigrés who, like Karen, had fled fascism. In this stimulating milieu, Karen became close friends with Harry Stack Sullivan, a pioneer of interpersonal psychiatry, and Erich Fromm, a fellow German-born psychoanalyst who blended Freud with Marx and social theory. With Fromm, Karen found both intellectual companionship and romantic chemistry. The two embarked on a passionate love affair, discovering in each other a meeting of minds, and for a time, hearts. They would stroll the tree-lined streets of Brooklyn deep in discussion about how culture shapes neurosis, or spend evenings in cafes debating the future of psychoanalysis. For Karen, who had endured so much loneliness and disillusionment, this relationship was intoxicating. Here was a man who valued her intellect and shared her iconoclastic spirit. However, the romance with Fromm would not last. Their fiery union eventually cooled and ended bitterly around the late 1930s. Accounts differ on what caused the split. Some say professional jealousy, others cite personal differences. But it left Karen hurt and betrayed. Still, even heartbreak served to strengthen her resolve to rely on herself. She poured her energy into her writing and teaching, determined to articulate the psychological vision that had been crystallizing inside her for years. In 1937, Horney published her first book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time, which immediately grabbed public attention. In plain, accessible prose, she explained how anxiety and neurosis are woven by the threads of culture, how the pressures to compete, to conform, to win love and approval in modern society could drive people into inner conflict. The book struck a chord far beyond the analytic community. Ordinary readers found her insights relatable to their own lives. Buoyed by this success, Karen followed up with New Ways in Psychoanalysis in 1939, in which she frankly laid out her disagreements with Freud's theory. She argued that psychoanalysis must evolve, that it must consider the whole person, including the present-day context, not just childhood sexuality and fantasy. Neurosis, she insisted, arises from disturbances in human relationships and adverse social conditions, not merely from thwarted libidinal urges. She rejected Freud's concept of the death instinct and Oedipus complex as universal explanations, pointing out that these could be better understood as byproducts of specific cultural upbringing, rather than immutable psychic facts. To traditional Freudians, this was heresy. To many others, especially younger analysts and those of a more humanistic bent, Horney's ideas were a breath of fresh air. By 1941, tensions between Karen Horney and the New York psychoanalytic establishment reached a breaking point. She had been serving on the teaching faculty of the Institute, but her unorthodox views were increasingly unwelcome. The Institute, aligned with orthodox Freudianism, expected adherence to Freud's doctrines. Karen could no longer pretend to toe the line. That year, she was effectively forced out of the Institute. Either one could call it an expulsion or a resignation by mutual agreement. But being shown the door was, paradoxically, liberating. It meant she could finally create the kind of psychoanalytic community she envisioned. True to her independent spirit, Karen wasted no time. In 1941, immediately after parting ways with the old guard, she founded a new organization, the Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis, AAP. She gathered around her a group of analysts and students receptive to her cultural school of psychoanalysis. Thinkers who believed, as she did, that therapy should focus on present realities as much as past conflicts, and that cultural change could heal psychic pain. She established a training institute under the AAP, called the American Institute of Psychoanalysis, where she became the dean. In these roles, Karen finally had a platform to train new therapists in her way of thinking. One can picture her in those years, briskly walking the halls of the Institute in Manhattan, her arms full of lecture notes and case files, greeting students with a warm but no-nonsense smile. She was in her late 50s now, at the height of her influence, energized by the chance to shape a more humane and socially conscious psychoanalysis. To further spread her approach, Horney also launched a journal, the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, serving as its first editor. The journal became a voice for alternative views and new ideas in therapy, reflecting Karen's wide-ranging interests, from neurosis and culture to women's psychology and beyond. Under her editorial guidance, articles explored how therapists could help patients grow and fulfill their potential, not just relieve symptoms. She championed the notion that psychoanalysis should aim for more than making sick people well. It could also guide essentially healthy people towards self-realization and richer lives. Amid this flurry of institutional leadership, Karen remained a dedicated writer. Throughout the 1940s, she continued publishing books, refining her theories. In Our Inner Conflicts, 1945, she dissected the struggles between different selves within a person. For instance, the clash between one's genuine feelings and the artificial persona one adopts to please others. She described how people develop neurotic needs, exaggerated desires for things like approval, power, or independence, as ways to cope with basic anxiety, and how these strategies, when rigid and compulsive, trap them in unhappiness. Importantly, she categorized these needs into 3 broad coping styles: moving toward people, seeking affection and approval; moving against people, seeking power and control; and moving away from people, seeking isolation and self-sufficiency. These were vivid, relatable depictions of how different personalities deal with insecurity. Horney's descriptions came not from abstract theorizing alone, but from keen observation of her patients, and, one suspects, introspection into her own habits of coping with anxiety and fear. In 1950, Horney published what many consider her magnum opus, Neurosis and Human Growth. In it, she painted a comprehensive picture of how a person can become alienated from their real self by internalizing the crushing dictates of culture and parental expectations. She warned of the tyranny of the shoulds, the unrealistic ideals we impose on ourselves. Example, I should be perfect, I should be totally selfless, that drive us to self-hatred when we inevitably fall short. Karen argued that therapy's task is to help individuals reclaim their true selves from these oppressive ideals, to gently strip away the neurotic defenses and find the genuine desires and potential underneath. There is an almost redemptive, optimistic tone in her writing at this stage. She believed deeply in the human capacity for growth if given a nurturing environment. In contrast to Freud's rather fatalistic view of human nature, caught between unyielding drives and repressive society, Horney saw people as capable of change, empowered by self-awareness and warm relationships. In this sense, she was a forerunner of the humanistic psychology movement that would blossom in the decades after her death, influencing thinkers like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who also focused on personal growth and self-actualization. Karen Horney continued to see patients in her private practice and to teach at the New York Medical College in her final years. Imagine her consulting room in those days, a modest, book-lined office on the Upper East Side, perhaps where a wise, gray-haired woman listens intently to a young man describing his crippling need for others' approval. Instead of interpreting his feelings purely in terms of infantile wishes or sexual frustrations, she gently guides him to see how his fear of rejection might stem from childhood loneliness, and how his constant people-pleasing, once a survival strategy to win care, now only makes him more anxious. She encourages him to experiment with being more honest about his needs, to develop an inner compass of his own values rather than the fickle acceptance of others. This was Karen's therapeutic style, probing yet supportive, challenging yet deeply respectful of the individual's capacity to grow. By the early 1950s, Horney's influence had spread far. She had students and followers around the world. Her earlier writings on feminine psychology, which had been somewhat sidelined as she turned her focus to general neurosis, were rediscovered by a new generation of women in psychology, planting seeds for what would later become feminist psychology. In those early papers, she had exposed how psychology had misunderstood women by projecting male biases, and she had called for understanding women on their own terms. Now, women scholars and clinicians in the 1960s would gather those essays and publish them as a collection titled Feminine Psychology, 1967, recognizing Horney as a pioneer who was ahead of her time. In the autumn of 1952, Karen Horney fell ill, quite suddenly. She had always been a vigorous woman, so when she was struck with an abdominal ailment that worsened rapidly, it took everyone by surprise. On December 4, 1952, at the age of 67, Karen Horney passed away in New York. The exact cause was most likely cancer, but whatever the illness, it moved swiftly. Her death sent ripples of sorrow through the community she had built. Colleagues and patients mourned the loss of a brilliant, compassionate mind who had given so much of herself to understanding others. Yet, even as they grieved, her legacy was already securely in motion. That same year, her friends and students established the Karen Horney Foundation to continue research and training in her approach. A few years later, in 1955, the Karen Horney Clinic opened in New York City as a living tribute, a place where those suffering could receive treatment informed by her humane principles. The clinic treated rich and poor alike, reflecting Karen's belief that therapy should be accessible and attuned to real-life problems, not a luxury for the elite. Karen Horney's story is one of quiet revolution. She started within Freud's shadow and then bravely stepped out of it, challenging some of the most fundamental assumptions of psychoanalysis. She confronted Freud's male-centric ideas with a feminist lens, contending that culture and inequality, not anatomy, shape women's psychology. She took the focus off instinctual drives and shone it on the anxiety of a child needing love in a big, frightening world. She reimagined therapy not as an archaeological dig for repressed secrets, but as a collaborative journey to help people rediscover themselves in the here and now. All these contributions have woven into the fabric of modern psychology. As the lights dimmed in the lecture hall that day in 1941, Karen had finished laying out her new ways in psychoanalysis to an audience that was alternately stunned, intrigued, and inspired. Perhaps she allowed herself a small smile as she stepped away from the podium, knowing that she had spoken her truth. She had stood up not only against Freud, the patriarch of her field, but against all forms of psychological dogma that stifled human potential. In doing so, she became an intellectual liberator for countless others. Decades later, whenever a therapist helps a patient focus on their real-life relationships, or a self-help book encourages someone to trust their inner worth, Karen Horney's spirit is there, quietly smiling. The rebel who challenged an orthodoxy and in turn helped forge a more hopeful, human-centered psychology.